Hi, I'm Miss Roz. Today we are going to be making homemade pasta as well as a last step of how to make homemade ravioli. So this will be broken out kind of into three segments. The first segment will be about how to make the dough itself and using a couple of different pieces of equipment in the kitchen. And then the second segment will be about how to roll out your dough, whether you're using a pasta maker or you're going to do it by hand. And then the last section will be about how to assemble ravioli if you're interested in making ravioli. So why don't we start out with the dough? So today we are going to need flour, eggs, olive oil, and some salt. All right, so I need about 2 1/3 cups of some flour, as well as about 1/3 of a cup of flour to the side for when I need to knead the dough. And then I have 4 eggs. I also have some salt, so I need um, a, about a half a teaspoon of some salt, and then some olive oil, which I need about a teaspoon of olive oil, and then I do have just a little water to the side in the case that I need it if my dough gets a little dry, right? So there's a couple ways that we can make pasta. You could do it by hand, which I will show you, but I also talk about the safety of using the food processor and also kind of what the equipment you should use if you're going to use your stand mixer, right? So let's talk about the food processor first. So you have, depending on the food processor you have, will depend on how you assemble it, right? However, when I make my dough, right, typically any dough I typically use the blade that is plastic, right? So you'll probably have a bunch of different attachments, but I tend to use this blade when I make dough. So the nice plastic blade, right? And then this is the base to my food processor, right? The key to the food processor is that you need to turn it on, but the only way you can get it to turn on is if it's all assembled correctly, and this is for safety reasons, so that you're not you're not going to chop off your finger, right? You will notice on the base that there is a little black dot, right? That black dot has to line up with the spring, right? So in mine, I have the spring right here in the handle, right? However, there are some food processors that have the spring on the opposite side. So you have to figure out which side your spring is on first, right? And then I need to let it fit in, right? And then I need to turn it so that it locks, right? So that spring should be above that black dot, right? And then I would put in my 2 1/3 cups of flour, and then my 4 eggs, my half a teaspoon of salt, and my teaspoon of olive oil, right? And then I would put the lid on, and then you gotta make sure that that lid locks into place, right? And then you can turn it on. If it doesn't turn on, it's probably because your food processor is not assembled correctly. So take it all apart and try to put it back together in hopes that you can get it to work. Okay, so and then I would just process it and let it come together in a dough ball. And then once the dough ball comes together, you can take it out, and you would knead it by hand for a little bit just to make sure that all of that dough comes together, right? That dough might be kind of more mealy. It might not come together quite as well in a dough ball, but the more you knead it, the more it will come together. It's kind of like making any other kind of dough, like scones and things like that, right? All right, so there's that option, right? The other option we have is to make it in the stand mixer, right? So just like with making it like yeast breads and things like that, I could use the stand mixer, right? Typically when I do this, right, I use 2 different attachments when I go to make dough, right? Instead of pouring all 2 1/3 cups of flour in, I would do about a cup or so, right? And then add all 4 eggs and use my flat paddle, right, or my regular beaters, right? And I would mix it until the dough is nice and smooth, and you know that you have all that flour and the egg mixed in together, right? And it's going to look kind of, liquidy, right? But then I would slowly add in more of your flour. However, when I go to mix it now, I'm going to change it to the dough hook since I'm making dough, right? Just like when we made yeast dough, we did the same thing because I want to start out with a nice smooth batter, right, and then use the dough hook to mix it all in together, right, and then I would just let it mix until it comes together. And then again, I always like to knead it by hand just a little, just to check and make sure that everything is good to go, right. So you could also then use the stand mixer, right. However, right, the fun way to do it, at least in my opinion, right, is to do it by hand, right. All you really need is a counter and a fork, right. So if you don't have any of this fancy equipment, you can still make homemade pasta, right. So really, all you need to do for the whole thing is you need a fork, a counter, and a knife, right. So one thing you want to make sure is that this counter is nice and clean before you start anything, because you are going to put this directly on the counter. Right now, if you're not one who likes to put and make dough directly on the counter, you can go ahead and use a cutting board if you like. I personally like to just do the counter myself. Right? When I went to Italy, my husband and I did a cooking class in Florence, and so this is how we actually did it. So we poured all of our flour onto the counter, right? And I know that this is difficult in this one because it is white counters with white flour, right? But let's just bring you on over so you can see it a little better. All right, and so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a nice big well into my flour, because that's actually where all my eggs are going to go. All right, so I want a nice big kind of volcano looking pile here. All right, and it will be okay if the egg ends up a little overflowing. We will fix that. All right, but I do want to kind of start out with a big crater in the middle of my dough. All right, I'm also going to take my ring off, right, and then crack my 4 eggs. Right. I never crack directly into any of the food that I make, right, which we've always talked about, right, so that I don't have any shell in there. 2, 3, and then 4. Right. Other videos may show that they crack the eggs directly into the flour, which is their prerogative. But it's much easier to fish out that shell, or if it's a bad egg, than to ruin all of my flour. All right. All right. So just trying to make this big. All right. Now I'm just going to pour my eggs into here. 4 of them. You don't necessarily have to beat the eggs beforehand if you don't want to, because you are going to beat them right directly in here. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to scramble my eggs in the middle of my crater here, right? And as I do this, right, I'm going to kind of grab some of that flour from the sides here and mix it in, right? And as that, starts to mix in, I'll grab a little more flour, and I'll slowly and gradually add some more flour into this egg mixture. And like I said, if it doesn't, if my egg kind of falls out a little, that's perfectly fine. No worries. Right? And so you're just going to continue to grab flour as my egg mixes in. Right? But you want to make sure that it stays nice and smooth if you can. So I like to mix it well before I add more flour. But this way, the way I'm doing it is I add small amounts of flour. Hopefully it doesn't get too lumpy. Okay. Right, this is a good workout for your hand. Right, and eventually this is going to get to a point where it's going to look more doughy than watery or liquidy. No, whoops. Let's see. I did forget to. I apologize. I forgot to add my salt. So we'll just add like a quarter or half a teaspoon of some salt. If you don't want to add the salt and olive oil, you don't have to. It's entirely up to you. And then just a teaspoon worth of olive oil. I do like the olive oil. It gives a nice smoother texture. It also gives a nice flavor to it. It's not a ton of olive oil. All right, but keep on mixing. All right, if you have to switch hands, go ahead. All right, and then as this gets bigger, okay, you can kind of push it in so that's easier to grab some more of that flour. And eventually it's going to get more dough-like, and then you can start kneading it more rather than mixing it. But okay, I also like to scrape it from the bottom, make sure I don't have any flour mixed to the bottom. Right, it does get a little messy. I probably should have worn my apron. Right, but as it starts to get a little more thicker, a little thicker here, I actually am going to start using my hands a little, I believe. There we go. All right. And start to knead this a little more as it's getting to be a little more difficult to use the fork. Okay, notice that I keep adding more flour before I start touching more of it. If you just put your hand directly in it, it's going to get sticky, and that's how you're going to get all that flour all over your hands. But if you do get flour on your hands, all right, go ahead and just rub it off, and then just keep working it. All right, and the more you work this, obviously the smoother it's going to get. All right, so it may seem a little dry in the beginning, right? But as I work it and work all that extra flour in, right, it should hopefully come together better. All right. All right, scrape off any of that off the fork if you would like. All right. And then just continue to knead, right? And if it's got stuck to the counter, that's fine. Just use your fork and scrape it up a little. There we go. Right, and then just continue to knead this just like we were doing with regular dough. Now we're just doing this with pasta dough. Right, it should be nice and smooth. Right, just like our regular doughs. Right, so continue to, all right, and it should not be sticky either. Right, so. All right, one thing about pasta though is that when you're done making the dough, it does need to rest a little, right? So you can't really use it right away. So you might want to put it either in a Ziploc or wrap it up in a little plastic wrap, all right? And then go ahead and put it in the fridge, all right? And just let it rest. Or actually, you could, I'm sorry, not in the fridge. You can just let it rest on the counter. If you, so it needs to rest for about a half an hour. If you plan on using it right away, then let it rest on the counter. If you don't think you're going to use it for a couple of hours because there's egg in it, I would definitely freeze it. Put it in the refrigerator and then take it out and let it rest at room temperature for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, just so that it comes to room temperature again. But, so go ahead and continue kneading this. Right, and as it starts to, you can see even like it's starting to get yellow here, right? But it is getting a little sticky, so again, add a little more flour to it. Right, you should probably use just about all the flour that was on the counter. You may or may not need that extra third cup for the kneading. All right. So continue to knead. Always a good workout. Get out your stress.